Some monsters don't live in the shadows. They stand in the broad daylight, wearing respectable suits and a smile that could charm a bird from a tree. They'll pat you on the back with one hand while methodically planning your ruin with the other, and the world will call them saints for it. My name is Brenda, and I am 82 years old. For most of my life, I've carried a secret that has settled in my soul like a cold, heavy stone from the bottom of the sea. A secret about the most respected man our small town of Port Blossom, Maine had ever known. The man everyone called a benefactor, a pillar of the community, but who, for me, was the architect of a prison built just for me. I still live in this old house, the one perched on a cliff overlooking the churning gray waters of the Atlantic. It's a sturdy place, built by a sea captain a century ago to withstand the northeasters that howl like banshees in the winter. The windows are caked with a fine layer of salt, a permanent haze that softens the view of the lobster boats bobbing in the harbor below. I bought this house with my own 2 hands, or rather, with the work they produced. Every dollar earned from thousands of hours of intricate needlepoint, stitch by painstaking stitch, went into this place. It was my declaration of independence, a fortress built of thread and determination. No one in Port Blossom knows the true price of this quiet life, of the freedom to simply sit here, listen to the gulls cry, and not be afraid. In the bottom drawer of an old cedar chest, I keep a faded photograph of my father, Billy. He was a lobsterman, through and through. His hands were a road map of his life, calloused and scarred from years of hauling traps and handling lines in the freezing cold. He was a man of few words, but he knew the language of the sea better than anyone. He could read the tides in the sky and smell a coming storm hours before the weather vane even thought about turning. Every morning, long before the sun had risen, the floorboards of our little house would creak as he prepared for the day. I'd lie in my bed, listening to the familiar sounds, the clink of his thermos, the heavy tread of his boots on the wooden porch, the cough of his boat's engine as it sputtered to life in the misty darkness of the harbor. He'd return in the evening, smelling of salt and diesel, his silhouette framed in the doorway against the fading light. On the good days, his worn face would be softened by a quiet satisfaction, and he'd bring home the best of his catch for our dinner. My mother, Donna, would be waiting, and the simple meal we'd share in our small kitchen was the anchor of my world. We were poor, like most families in Port Blossom in the late 50s. Our house was small, the furniture was worn, and my dresses were often patched. But we weren't hungry, and we weren't unhappy. As my father always said, with a quiet confidence that seemed as vast as the ocean itself, as long as the sea provides, we'll be all right. But the sea is a fickle provider. I was 17 when our world began to tilt on its axis. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The lobster catches grew thinner. The traps my father pulled from the deep, day after day, were coming up lighter, sometimes nearly empty. It seemed the ocean itself, which had sustained generations of Port Blossom families, was closing its hand. My father grew quieter, the lines around his eyes deepening not from the sun, but from a worry that gnawed at him day and night. He'd come home and stare out at the water for hours, as if trying to will the lobsters back into his traps. The silence in our little house grew heavier, thick with unspoken fears. It was during those lean, anxious months that Mr. Sinclair started visiting. To the rest of Port Blossom, he was Mr. Harrison Sinclair, the town's undisputed king. He owned the cannery that employed half the women, the shipyard where the boats were repaired, and the general store where everyone bought their supplies on credit. It was said that a fish couldn't be sold, a boat couldn't be mended, nor a loan secured without his silent approval. He was a man of immense presence, always impeccably dressed. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the front pew, and his donations to the community were legendary. He helped families who had fallen on hard times, paid for the new roof on the town hall, and sponsored the high school baseball team. He was, by all accounts, a model of civic virtue. "Billy," he said one evening, sitting at our kitchen table as if he belonged there, his voice smooth and reassuring. My mother had offered him coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "These are tough times for the fishermen. The sea is a harsh mistress. Let me help you." My father, a man whose pride was as solid and unyielding as the granite cliffs lining the coast, refused at first. He thanked Mr. Sinclair for his concern, but insisted they would manage. But Mr. Sinclair was persistent. He didn't talk about charity. He was too clever for that. He spoke of a business loan, a simple arrangement. He mentioned new state-of-the-art traps that could be set in deeper waters, and a powerful new engine for my father's boat, one that would allow him to travel farther offshore, where the lobsters were rumored to still be plentiful. He painted a picture not of a handout, but of a smart investment in the future. He spoke with the confident, soothing voice of a savior. I remember my mother's expression that night. She watched Mr. Sinclair, her gaze steady, as if trying to peel back the layers of his polished benevolence to see what lay beneath. But desperation is a powerful blinder. It makes you want to believe in saviors, even when a small voice deep inside is screaming a warning. And we were desperate. After that first visit, Mr. Sinclair became a regular presence in our home. He never arrived empty-handed. There was always a bag of fresh groceries from his store, a bottle of wine for my parents, or a small box of chocolates for me. He would ask about my studies, compliment my mother on her cooking, and discuss the state of the world with my father as if they were equals. But they weren't, and everyone in that small kitchen knew it. The power imbalance was a silent, hulking guest at our table. "Brenda is growing into a fine young woman," he'd often say to my mother, his eyes lingering on me for a moment too long as I cleared the dishes. The comment always made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why. He was an important man, a respected elder who was helping my father. That was all that should have mattered. "You must be very proud." My mother would offer a polite, tight smile, her hand finding mine under the table, her grip a little too firm. It's funny how a whole town can hold its breath, pretending not to see the strings that make everyone dance. I wonder if it's still like that in small towns today. The illusion of neighborly concern shattered one evening in the late fall. The air had turned crisp, and the leaves on the few hardy trees that dotted our rocky landscape had turned a brilliant, fleeting shade of orange. Mr. Sinclair arrived with his son, Carl. Carl was nearly 10 years my senior, a man in his late 20s who worked in one of his father's shipping offices in Boston. He carried himself with an air of city-bred confidence that was alien to our small town. He wore expensive clothes and drove a new car that gleamed under the pale autumn sun, a rare sight in Port Blossom. While his father engaged my parents in conversation, Carl watched me. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just watched, his gaze steady and assessing, as if he were examining a piece of property he was considering acquiring. The conversation that night was different. Mr. Sinclair eventually steered it away from fishing and the weather. "My son has built a fine life for himself in Boston," he announced, his voice filled with paternal pride. "He has a good position, a bright future. All he needs now is a good wife. A respectable girl from a good family who knows the value of hard work and loyalty." The silence that followed was as heavy and cold as a tombstone. My father looked at my mother, then at me, then back at Mr. Sinclair. The implication was unmistakable, hanging in the air like smoke. "Brenda is too young," my father said finally, his voice strained. "She has her schooling to finish." Mr. Sinclair smiled, a slow, patient expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Billy, be reasonable. What future does a bright girl like her have here? In Port Blossom? With Carl, she'll have a beautiful home in the city, fine clothes, a comfortable life. Isn't that what every father wants for his daughter?" "Not now," my father insisted, his jaw tight. "In a few years, maybe, when she's older." "A few years?" Mr. Sinclair's voice was still pleasant, but an edge of steel had crept into it. Billy, that loan I extended to you, it was not an insignificant sum. And the new engine for your boat? I imagine that was quite costly. My mother went pale. Billy, what is he talking about? She whispered. My father wouldn't meet her eyes. I saw the shame wash over him, a deep, painful flush. The loan, I realized then, was much, much larger than they had let on. And the new engine, he hadn't bought it. It had been given to him, a gift from Mr. Sinclair, a gift that was now being called due. Don't you worry, Mr. Sinclair said, rising from his chair. I'm sure we'll come to an understanding. Carl is a patient man, aren't you, son? Carl nodded, his eyes still fixed on me, and in his gaze I saw something that terrified me to my core. It wasn't affection or even desire. It was possession. It was the look of a man who has already decided he owns you. That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to my parents' hushed, frantic whispers from the kitchen. My mother was crying. How could you, Billy? How could you accept so much from him without telling me? What choice did I have? My father's voice was broken, stripped of its usual strength. The traps were empty, Donna. There was no work. We would have lost the house. And now you'll sell your daughter to pay your debts? The accusation was raw, painful. It's not like that. Mr. Sinclair just wants... I know what he wants, my mother sobbed. Everyone in this town knows what happens when you owe him a favor. And now it's our turn. I understood then. The stories I'd overheard, the whispers about families who had suddenly come into good fortune after a daughter married a man of Mr. Sinclair's choosing or a son took a job far away. These weren't favors. They were transactions. And I was the currency. In the weeks that followed, my father became a man possessed. He worked himself to the bone, trying to find a way out of the invisible cage that was closing around us. He took his boat out in weather that kept saner men ashore, pushing the new engine to its limits, desperate for a catch large enough to make a dent in his debt. He sought extra work on the docks, mending nets for other fishermen, his pride swallowed by his terror. He even wrote to distant relatives, asking for help, only to be met with polite refusals. The debt was too large, and Mr. Sinclair's influence was too pervasive. No one dared to cross him. The end came 2 weeks later. He went out in a churning sea under a sky the color of slate. A storm was brewing offshore, and my mother had begged him not to go. Just one more day, he'd told her, his face grim. One good haul is all I need. He never came back. They called it a tragic accident. The official story was that a line had gotten tangled in the propeller of the new engine, causing the boat to capsize in the rough waves. My father wasn't a strong swimmer. They found his body the next day, washed ashore on a desolate stretch of beach miles down the coast. At the funeral, the whole town turned out. Mr. Sinclair was the first to offer his condolences. He placed a heavy hand on my mother's shoulder, his expression a perfect mask of sorrow. Don't you worry about a thing, Donna, he said, his voice resonating with false sympathy. I'll take care of you and Brenda now. I looked at my mother's face. It was ashen, her eyes red from weeping, but behind the grief, I saw something else flicker into life, pure, undiluted terror. She knew, as I did, what those words truly meant. We were no longer just indebted to him. We were his property. The debt had been paid not with money, but with my father's life, and my own future was the final installment. He had taken everything, and now he had come to collect the last piece. The days that followed my father's funeral were hollowed out, silent spaces. The casseroles and condolences from the townspeople stopped, and a thick, suffocating quiet settled over our little house. It was the quiet of a final breath being held. My mother, Donna, seemed to shrink before my eyes. The grief for her husband was a terrible, raw thing, but it was tangled with a paralytic fear that was even worse. She would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the worn linoleum floor, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. We didn't talk about what was coming. We didn't have to. It was a guest in our house now, sitting in my father's empty chair, its shadow stretching over everything. Mr. Sinclair gave us a week. A week of what he probably considered a respectable mourning period. Then he appeared at our door one evening as the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the porch. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, bringing with him the chill of the autumn air and an aura of absolute authority. My mother flinched as if she'd been struck. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He sat at our table, placing his immaculate hat beside him, and folded his hands. He looked not at my mother, but at me. "Brenda," he began, his voice calm and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted as law. "I have spoken with Carl. He is a good man, with a fine future. He is prepared to take you as his wife. He will provide for you, give you a good life in Boston, a life your poor father could only have dreamed of." Each word was a nail being hammered into my coffin. I wanted to scream, to rage, to throw something, to tell him what I thought of his son, of his offer, of him. I wanted to tell him that he had murdered my father as surely as if he'd held his head beneath the waves himself. But I looked at my mother. Her face was a mask of pleading terror. Her eyes begged me to be silent, to submit. She had already lost her husband. She could not bear to lose her home, her security, everything that was left. She believed we had no other choice. And in Port Blossom, a town held entirely in Mr. Sinclair's pocket, she was right. "It's for the best," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "This will settle Billy's outstanding debt, of course. A clean slate. I will see to it that your mother is taken care of, Donna. She can remain in this house for as long as she likes, and a stipend from the cannery will be arranged for her. A widow's pension. Consider it a gesture of my deep respect for your late husband." The lie was so audacious, so monstrous, that it left me breathless. He was packaging our ruin as an act of charity, our enslavement as a gesture of respect. He was not only taking my life, but demanding our gratitude for it. My mother began to weep, silent, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair," she managed to whisper through her tears. "You are a good man." The words felt like a betrayal sharper than any knife. But I knew she said them out of fear, not conviction. Mr. Sinclair nodded, accepting her gratitude as his due. He rose from the table, his business concluded. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks," he announced. "A simple affair at the Justice of the Peace. Carl will come from Boston to collect you. Pack your things, Brenda." And then he was gone, leaving the door open behind him. The cold night air rushed in, but it was no colder than the ice that had just formed around my heart. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of numb preparation. I packed my few belongings into a single suitcase. My mother, moving like a ghost through the house, carefully folded my clothes, her hands lingering on each item as if it were a memory she was saying goodbye to. We barely spoke. There was nothing left to say. The town watched, of course. I'd see their faces in the windows of the general store, their quick, pitying glances as I walked down the street. They knew. They all knew. But they were as powerless as I was, each of them caught in their own small way in the web Mr. Sinclair had woven around Port Blossom. The only person I sought out was Elaine, the old woman who had taught me the art of needlepoint. She lived in a tiny cottage by the marsh, a woman whose husband had been lost to the sea decades ago. She had turned her grief and solitude into beauty, her fingers creating breathtakingly intricate worlds on linen, with nothing but a needle and thread. She had taught me her craft, seeing in me a patience and a quiet intensity that she recognized. When I told her I was leaving, that I was to be married, she looked at me with her wise, knowing eyes. She didn't offer congratulations. She simply took my hands in her own, her touch surprisingly strong. "Remember what the needle teaches us, child," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Out of chaos, you can make order. Out of a blank canvas, you can create a world of your own. No matter where you are, no one can take that away from you." She pressed a small, velvet-wrapped bundle into my hand. It was a set of fine silver needles and a rainbow of silk threads. "Your hands know the way," she said. "Don't ever let them forget." The day of the wedding was gray and overcast. Carl arrived in his gleaming car, looking impatient. The ceremony in the drab office of the Justice of the Peace took less than 5 minutes. I stood beside this stranger, this man who was now my husband, and felt nothing. I was an observer in my own life, watching a tragedy unfold from a great distance. His hand on my arm was firm, proprietary. His vows were spoken in a flat, bored tone. My own were a whisper I could barely hear. My mother stood behind us, her face swollen from crying. Mr. Sinclair was the only other witness, his expression one of quiet triumph. The drive to Boston was made in near total silence. I watched the familiar, rugged coastline of Maine retreat and then disappear, replaced by highways and unfamiliar towns. Each mile was a stitch, sewing me further and further away from everything I had ever known. The apartment was in a tall, respectable building in a quiet part of the city. It was beautiful, I suppose. The furniture was new and expensive, the carpets were thick, and the large windows overlooked a manicured park. But it was sterile, impersonal. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter of a life lived. It was a showroom, not a home. "You'll want for nothing here," Carl said as he dropped my suitcase in the middle of the living room floor. It was not a promise of comfort, but a statement of fact, a reminder of our transaction. The mask of the charming, successful son fell away that first night. The man I was now bound to was not the man his father presented to the world. The politeness was gone, replaced by a chilling arrogance and a temper that could flare in an instant. He treated my body as he treated everything else he owned, as something to be used for his satisfaction, without regard for my feelings, my fear, or my pain. I cried myself to sleep, muffling the sounds in a pillow, while he slept soundly beside me, a conqueror in his newly acquired territory. The rules of my new life were established quickly and brutally. I was not to leave the apartment without his permission. He gave me a small allowance for groceries, demanding a receipt for every penny spent. He forbade me from looking for a job or taking classes. "A wife's place is in the home," he'd say, his voice laced with a sneer. "Especially a wife from a place like Port Blossom. You wouldn't know how to act in the city." My weekly calls to my mother became an exercise in agony. He would sit in the room, listening to every word, and I would have to weave a tapestry of lies, telling her how beautiful the apartment was, how kind Carl was, how happy I was. I could hear the desperate hope in her voice, wanting so badly to believe me, and it broke my heart anew each time. He delighted in demeaning me, in reminding me of my origins. I was his little lobster girl, the charity case his father had rescued. He criticized the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I ate. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, to move through the silent, perfect apartment like a shadow, trying to do nothing that might draw his attention or ignite his unpredictable anger. The golden cage had become a real prison, and I was its only inmate. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant ache in my chest. It was during one long, empty afternoon, when the silence of the apartment was pressing in on me, that I remembered Elaine's gift. I found my old sewing box at the bottom of my suitcase, a place Carl had never bothered to look. I unwrapped the velvet bundle. The silver needles gleamed, and the silk threads shimmered like trapped jewels. My hands, which had grown accustomed to trembling, felt a flicker of their old purpose. I began to sew. At first, my stitches were clumsy, my fingers stiff, but soon the familiar rhythm returned. The push and pull of the needle, the steady drawing of the thread. As Elaine had said, my hands knew the way. I worked in secret, hiding my needlepoint whenever I heard Carl's key in the door. The linen became my diary, my confessional. I stitched the churning gray sea that I missed so desperately. I stitched the granite cliffs of Port Blossom, the silhouette of my father's boat against a rising sun. I stitched my rage into stormy skies and my sorrow into fields of pale, weeping willows. The needlepoint became my sanity. In a life where I had no control, here I was the creator. I decided on the colors, the patterns, the story the threads would tell. It was my one small act of rebellion. Months bled into one another. Mr. Sinclair would call on Sundays, and Carl would transform into the dutiful, loving husband, speaking to me with a cloying sweetness that made my stomach turn. He'd hold the phone to my ear, and I'd murmur the expected pleasantries to the man who had orchestrated my misery. Then, one morning, a new kind of dread took root. A sickness that had nothing to do with sorrow. A change in my own body that I could not ignore. I was pregnant. The knowledge landed not with joy, but with a cold, terrifying certainty. I was to bring a child into this prison, a child who would be bound to these men, to this legacy of cruelty and control. A part of me wanted to despair, but another, fiercer part, a part I didn't know I possessed, rose up. A primal, protective instinct. This was no longer just about my survival. I waited for a day when Carl was in a decent mood to tell him. He listened, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow, proud smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of tenderness or shared joy. It was the smug smile of a man who has just had his own value confirmed. "Well," he said, looking me up and down as if assessing livestock, "it's about time." He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't touch me gently. He walked to the phone to call his father. "Father," I heard him boom, his voice filled with masculine pride, "you're going to be a grandfather. We're having an heir." An heir. Not a baby, not our child, an asset, a continuation of the Sinclair name. Something shifted in our house after that. The angry outbursts lessened, the casual cruelty was reined in. But it wasn't replaced with kindness. It was replaced with a chilling kind of proprietary concern. He watched what I ate. He forbade me from doing any heavy lifting. He would place a hand on my growing stomach, not with affection, but with the air of a man checking on his most valuable investment. He was no longer just my jailer. He was the guardian of the Sinclair legacy. This new treatment was, in its own way, even more dehumanizing. I was not a person, not a wife, not a mother-to-be. I was a vessel. And so I retreated further into my secret world of needle and thread. I began to stitch things for the baby. A small blanket with tiny leaping dolphins. A little cap embroidered with stars. With every stitch, I made a silent vow to the child growing inside me. I don't know how, I stitched, my needle moving in and out of the fabric, a frantic, rhythmic prayer. I don't know when. But I will get you out of here. I will take you to the sea. I will show you a world where you are loved, not for your name, but for who you are. I lay in the dark most nights, feeling the new life move within me, a tiny, fluttering secret in the oppressive silence of that apartment. It was the first sign of hope I'd had in a very long time. And as I held my hand over the life I was now sworn to protect, I felt it for the first time. A tiny, determined kick from within. A message, not of submission, but of a strength that was not just my own anymore. It was the first beat of a war drum, a quiet promise in the dark that our story was not over yet. The birth of my son, in a sterile white room smelling of antiseptic, was a lonely ordeal. Carl had driven me to the hospital with an air of grim impatience, as if I were a piece of faulty machinery in need of repair. He stayed for a while, pacing the hallway, before announcing he had an important meeting he couldn't miss and that the doctors could handle it from here. He left, and I was alone with the pain and the fear, surrounded by strangers in crisp uniforms. But the moment they placed my son in my arms, the cold clinical room and all the loneliness in the world simply vanished. He was so small, so perfect. He looked at me with wide, dark eyes, and in that instant, a fierce, primal love ignited within me, a love so powerful it felt like it could burn down the world. It was a force of nature, a love that demanded action, a love that could not allow this child to be raised in the shadow of fear. I named him Robert for my father. It was a private act of defiance, a way of connecting my son to the goodness and integrity of the man he would never know, a shield against the legacy of the man whose name he was forced to carry. When Carl returned, he glanced at the baby in the bassinet with a look of detached approval. "A boy," he said, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Good. My father will be pleased." He showed little interest in Robert as a person, more as a trophy he had successfully produced. For him, the ordeal was over, the product delivered. Mr. Sinclair, however, was a different story. He arrived the day I brought Robert home, sweeping into the apartment with an almost manic energy. He barely acknowledged me, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in my arms. "Let me see him," he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. He took Robert from me, holding him not with the gentle awkwardness of a new grandfather, but with a disturbing sense of ownership. "He has the Sinclair look about him," he declared, peering intently at the baby's face. "There's strength here. He'll do great things. He'll take over the business one day, be more successful than Carl and I combined." He spoke of Robert's future as if it were a pre-written script, a destiny of power and wealth already sealed. Listening to him, a cold dread washed over me. I was not just escaping a cruel husband. I had to save my son from being forged into a monster, another link in a chain of powerful, heartless men. His visits became a regular torment, each one a reminder of the gilded cage he was building around my son's future. In that silent apartment, Robert became my entire world. His first smile, the way his tiny hand would grip my finger, the soft sounds he made in his sleep, these were the things that kept me alive. He was a small, warm sun in my cold, dark universe. For him, I perfected the art of invisibility. I learned to anticipate Carl's moods, to have his dinner on the table the moment he walked in the door, to keep the apartment in a state of silent, sterile perfection. My entire existence was dedicated to creating a fragile peace, a buffer zone between my son's innocence and his father's unpredictable cruelty. It was in this period that I met Joan. She was a cleaner who came to the building twice a week. She was a quiet, unassuming woman, older than me, with a way of moving that was both efficient and gentle. At first we exchanged only polite nods, but she saw things. I knew she did. She saw the way I flinched when a door slammed, the way I sometimes held my arm as if it were bruised, the forced brightness in my voice when Carl was home. She never said a word, but in her eyes I saw not pity, but a deep, quiet understanding. One afternoon, she came into the spare room where I was hastily hiding my needlepoint. She stopped, her gaze falling on a piece I was working on, a vibrant, chaotic seascape with waves that looked like they were trying to claw their way off the fabric. "My goodness," she whispered, her voice full of genuine awe. "That's alive." It was the first time anyone in that city had looked at me and seen something other than Carl Sinclair's wife. I felt tears spring to my eyes. Hesitantly, I showed her some of my other pieces, the hidden chronicles of my grief and longing. She listened as I quietly explained what the work meant to me, and in that small, sunlit room, a fragile alliance was formed. "You have a gift, Brenda," she told me, her voice firm. "A real gift. My sister sells handmade quilts and crafts at a market on the weekends. People pay good money for work like this. Beautiful work." A seed of an idea, wild and impossible, was planted. Money. My own money. An escape fund. Joan offered to take a small piece to her sister, just to see. A week later, she returned and pressed a small wad of bills into my hand. It wasn't much, but as I held it, it felt like a bar of solid gold. It was the first money I had earned since I was a teenager, the first step on a long road out of hell. And so, our conspiracy began. I would sew with a frantic energy whenever Carl was at work, and once a month, Joan would smuggle out my finished pieces and return with the profits, which I hid in a loose-lidded jar at the back of the pantry behind old spices. Each dollar was a stitch in my plan, a quiet promise of a future I could barely dare to imagine. Robert was just over a year old when I realized, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, that I was pregnant again. The news brought no flicker of hope this time, only a cold, heavy dread. Another child would be another anchor, another chain binding me to Carl, to this life. Carl was even less interested the second time around. "Just make sure it's another boy," was all he said, as if I were placing an order from a catalog. The fragile truce that my first pregnancy had created was well and truly over. Carl's temper, which had been simmering, began to boil over again. He was having problems at work, and he brought his frustrations home with him, using me as the outlet for his rage. The shouting returned, followed by the shoves, the tight grip on my arm, the looming menace that filled every corner of our pristine apartment. My life became a terrifying dance, trying to soothe a teething baby while simultaneously placating a volatile man. The end of my old life, and the beginning of my fight for a new one, came on a rainy Tuesday night. Carl came home late, smelling of whiskey and failure. A big deal he'd been working on had fallen through, and he was looking for someone to blame. He started shouting the moment he walked in the door, his voice a venomous roar that made the crystal glasses in the cabinet tremble. Robert, startled by the noise, began to cry in his crib. "Can't you even keep that brat quiet?" Carl bellowed, advancing on me. I tried to calm him, using the soft, placating words I had learned to use, but he wasn't listening. He was lost in his own drunken fury. I don't remember all the details of what happened next. My mind has mercifully blurred the edges of the memory. I remember backing away. I remember tripping over the edge of a rug. I remember a sharp, searing pain, and then a darkness that swallowed me whole. I woke up in a hospital bed. The first thing I felt was a profound and unnerving emptiness. A doctor came in, a kind man with a tired face, and explained in gentle terms that there had been complications. The baby was gone. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing and everything all at once. Carl appeared later, his demeanor sullen and defensive, but not remorseful. "The doctor said these things happen sometimes," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "It's not a big deal. We'll make another one. You're young." And in that moment, something inside me broke. Or perhaps something was finally forged. The grief for the child I had lost was a terrible, physical agony. But beneath it, a cold, hard resolve began to form, solidifying out of the molten rage in my soul. I would not make another one. I would not let Robert grow up to witness this, to be shaped by this violence, to become this man. I would get him out, or I would die trying. It's a strange thing how the deepest betrayals can sometimes open the very door you need to escape, how a final, cruel act can become a gift of clarity. When I returned to the apartment, I was a different woman. On the outside, I was quiet, subdued, the grieving wife. On the inside, I was a general planning a campaign. I told Joan everything. I saw the fury in her eyes, but also a fierce determination. She became my co-conspirator, my lifeline. "We need a plan," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper as we sat in the kitchen one afternoon while Robert napped. A good one. The plan we devised was simple, but dangerous. My mother's health had been poor for years. I would tell Carl that she had taken a turn for the worse, that the doctor had called, that I needed to go home to Port Blossom for a couple of weeks to care for her. I would, of course, have to take Robert with me. It was a plausible story, an appeal to the duty of a daughter that even a man like Carl would have a hard time refusing, especially if he wanted to maintain the illusion of being a respectable husband to the outside world. I spent the next month sewing like a woman possessed. My needle flew, my fingers raw, channeling all my pain and fury into the most beautiful, intricate work I had ever produced. Joan sold it all, and my escape fund grew. It was almost enough. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place by accident. I was gathering Carl's clothes for the dry cleaner when a small, expensive-looking earring fell from his coat pocket. It was not mine. Later that week, I answered the phone, and a woman with a soft, breathy voice asked for Carl. When I said he wasn't home, she hung up immediately. The signs were unmistakable. Carl had a mistress. For another woman, this might have been the final crushing betrayal. For me, it was a gift. It explained his recent absences, his distraction. More importantly, it meant he would be glad to have me gone for a few weeks. My presence was an inconvenience to his new life. I felt no jealousy, no heartbreak, only a cold, sharp-edged relief. His secret gave me my freedom. That night, I put the plan into action. With tears I didn't have to fake, I told him that my mother was gravely ill, that I needed to go home. Just as I predicted, he barely put up a fight. He seemed almost eager for me to leave. 2 weeks, Brenda, he said, his tone magnanimous. That's all. Then you and the boy are to be back here. Understood? Understood, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. The night before I was to leave, I packed. I took one small suitcase for myself and Robert. I packed our few clothes, my precious box of needles and thread, and the jar of money from the back of the pantry. I left behind everything else, the expensive clothes, the jewelry, the entire life that had been a lie. Early the next morning, with Robert asleep in my arms, I walked out of that apartment for the last time. I didn't look back. Joan was waiting for me in a taxi at the corner of the street. She didn't take me to the train station that went north to Maine. She took me to the main bus terminal. "He might think to check the trains to Port Blossom," she whispered, pressing a thick envelope into my hand. "Here. It's not much, but it'll help." She hugged me tightly. "Be safe, Brenda. Be free." I bought 2 one-way tickets to New York City, a place so vast, so anonymous, I prayed we could disappear. As I settled into the worn seat of the bus with my sleeping son nestled against my chest, the engine rumbled to life. The bus pulled out of the dark station and into the gray light of dawn. I watched the skyline of Boston, the city that had been my prison, grow smaller and smaller in the window until it was nothing more than a bad memory. I didn't know what lay ahead. I had no job, no place to live, no one. All I had was a small boy, a box of needles, and a heart full of terror and a wild, defiant hope. For the first time in years, I was in charge of my own story, and I had just turned the page. The bus ride to New York was a long, rumbling journey through a landscape of purgatory. With every mile that separated me from Boston, a knot of fear in my stomach slowly, cautiously began to unwind. But it was replaced by a different kind of anxiety, the vast, terrifying unknown that lay ahead. Robert slept for most of the trip, his small body warm against mine, his steady breathing a tiny anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. I stared out the window at the passing blur of towns and highways, each one a place where I didn't belong, on my way to a city where I would be just one of millions of anonymous souls. Arriving at the Port Authority bus terminal was like being plunged into a churning sea of humanity. The sheer scale of the place, the roar of the crowds, the cacophony of languages, the press of bodies. It was an assault on the senses. For a moment, clutching my sleeping son and our single suitcase, I was paralyzed by a feeling of utter insignificance. In Port Blossom, my life had been defined by the people who knew me. In Boston, by the man who owned me. Here, I was nothing, a ghost, and the thought was both terrifying and intoxicatingly liberating. The first week was the hardest. Money was draining away at an alarming rate. I found a room in a women's boarding house in a noisy, run-down neighborhood. The room was tiny, the single window looking out onto a brick wall, and the building smelled of old cabbage and despair. But it was a locked door, a roof over our heads. I spent my days walking, pushing Robert in a second-hand stroller I'd bought, trying to get my bearings. The city was a monster of stone and steel, indifferent to our existence. I saw the judgment in the eyes of my fellow boarders, a young single mother with no husband in sight. I felt the familiar shame, but I pushed it down. Shame was a luxury I could no longer afford. My lifeline was my needlepoint. I knew I had to start earning money, and fast. Following a lead from a woman at the boarding house, I found my way to a weekend street market in Greenwich Village. It was a vibrant, chaotic place, a world away from the manicured parks of Boston. Artists and artisans laid out their wares on blankets and rickety tables, selling everything from handmade jewelry to strange, welded sculptures. My first Saturday there, I felt like an imposter. I found a small, unoccupied patch of pavement, laid out a dark cloth, and arranged my pieces on it. My work, with its intricate emotional detail and quiet sorrow, felt out of place amongst the loud colors and bold designs around me. People streamed past, their eyes skimming over my display without really seeing it. My heart sank with each passing hour. As the sun began to set, I had sold only one small piece, a tiny embroidered bluebird, for $5. It was barely enough to cover our food for the next day. But I went back the next day and the next weekend. I had no other choice. Slowly, things began to change. A few people started to notice. They wouldn't just glance, they would stop, their expressions growing thoughtful as they studied the stories I had stitched into the fabric. They saw the trapped birds, the stormy seas, the figures standing on lonely cliffs. "There's so much feeling in these," a woman murmured one afternoon, her fingers gently tracing the waves in one of my seascapes. She bought it, and for a price that made my hands tremble. My confidence began to grow in tiny, fragile increments. I was not just Brenda, the runaway wife. I was an artist. My work had value. My story, the one I poured into my art, mattered to someone. I learned then that you can build new walls to keep yourself safe, but the ghosts of the past don't need a key to get in. They walk right through them. The fear of being found was a constant companion, a cold shadow that followed me even on the sunniest days. Every time a well-dressed man paused too long near my display, my heart would leap into my throat. Was he one of them? Had Mr. Sinclair sent him? The turning point, the moment my life pivoted from mere survival to something resembling hope, came on a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after I'd arrived in the city. A woman stopped at my stall. She was the epitome of elegance, with a quiet confidence in her bearing that was unmistakable. She examined each of my pieces with a focused, intelligent eye, her expression serious and appreciative. This was not a casual browser. "This is extraordinary work," she said finally, her voice clear and refined. "The technique is flawless, but it's the emotion that's truly captivating. It's like reading a diary. Who taught you?" "A woman from my hometown," I replied, my voice shy. Her name was Elaine. "Well, Elaine taught you well," the woman said, a warm smile briefly lighting up her face. My name is Mrs. Davenport. I own a small boutique uptown on Madison Avenue. We specialize in unique, handcrafted accessories and apparel. I have never seen anything quite like this. She picked up one of my most personal pieces, a depiction of a small, sturdy house on a cliff, battered by waves, with a single light shining in one window. I would like to buy this, she said, and I would like to talk to you about creating a collection for my boutique. I could only stare at her, speechless. Madison Avenue. A collection. It was a dream so far beyond the scope of my reality that I couldn't process it. Mrs. Davenport seemed to understand. She gave me her card, paid me a sum for the piece that was more than I had made in the entire previous month, and said, "Call me on Monday. I believe we can do great things together, you and I." That phone call changed everything. Mrs. Davenport was as good as her word, and then some. She wasn't just a buyer, she became a mentor. She saw not just a desperate young woman with a curious talent, but an artist with a unique, powerful voice. She gave me a generous advance and a contract for a series of exclusive pieces. With that money, I moved us out of the boarding house. I found a small, clean, one-bedroom apartment in a safe, quiet neighborhood with a window that let in the morning sun and looked out over a tiny community garden. The first time I locked the door to our new home, a home that I was paying for, I leaned against it and wept with a relief so profound it left me weak. For the first time since I was a girl, I felt safe. Robert, now a toddler, thrived. He had a small park to play in, other children to laugh with. I could buy him new shoes, good food, picture books. I worked from our sunny living room, stitching the stories of my past, but now they were infused with a new thread of hope. Under Mrs. Davenport's guidance, I began to sign my work, not with my married name, but with a new one we chose together, Brenda Ellion. A new name for a new life. My work sold incredibly well in Mrs. Davenport's boutique. Her wealthy clients were captivated by the raw, narrative power of my embroidery. I was no longer stitching just for survival. I was creating art, and for the first time, I felt a sense of pride, of purpose. The ghost of Carl Sinclair and his father began to fade, their shadows receding from my daily life. But I had learned my lesson. The sea can be calm for a long time, but you never turn your back on it. The first sign of the coming storm was subtle. A man at the playground where I took Robert. He was well dressed, in a dark suit that was out of place amongst the mothers and nannies. He didn't have a child with him. He just sat on a bench, reading a newspaper, but I could feel his eyes on us. I quickly gathered Robert and left, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I told myself I was being paranoid, that New York was full of strange people. But I saw him again a week later, near the market where I bought our groceries. This time our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and his gaze was cold, empty, and assessing. It was the same look Carl had given me the first time we met. The confirmation of my deepest fear came 2 days later. It was a plain white envelope slipped under our apartment door sometime in the middle of the night. There was no stamp, no address. My name, Brenda, was typed on the front. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. Inside was a single typed line. A boy needs his grandfather. Mr. Sinclair wants to see his heir. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. They had found us. The safety I had so painstakingly built was an illusion. The walls of my small, sunny apartment suddenly felt as fragile as paper. He hadn't sent the police. He hadn't sent lawyers. He had sent a message, a quiet, chilling reminder of his power. He could reach me anytime, anywhere. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a summons. For 2 days, I was paralyzed by terror. I didn't leave the apartment. I triple-checked the locks on the door and windows. Every footstep in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through me. I held Robert so tightly he squirmed to get down, oblivious to the invisible threat that had entered our lives. My first instinct was to run again, to pack our bag and disappear into the night, find another city, another name. But where would we go? He had found me in the biggest city in the country. He would find me again. And Robert was not a baby anymore. He had a life here, a semblance of stability. To rip him away from that now felt like a different kind of cruelty. On the third day, my terror finally gave way to a cold, hard anger. The same anger that had fueled my escape from Boston. He would not have my son. I would not let Robert be turned into a Sinclair. I would burn the world down first. With my heart in my throat, I called Mrs. Davenport. I asked if I could see her, that it was an emergency. When I arrived at her beautiful, serene home, the dam of my composure broke. I told her everything, the whole sordid, ugly story, about Port Blossom, my father, the debt, the forced marriage, about Carl's cruelty, the lost baby, the escape, and about the man on the bench and the note under my door. She listened without interruption, her elegant face growing harder and more determined with every word I spoke. She did not offer pity. She offered strength. "This is not your shame, Brenda," she said, her voice fierce. "This is theirs, and we will not let these men win. You are not that scared girl from Maine anymore." She made a phone call. An hour later, I was sitting in the polished wood office of a man named Mr. Davies, an attorney. He was calm, serious, and listened to my story a second time, asking sharp, insightful questions. "You have grounds for divorce, certainly," he said when I had finished, "and for sole custody of your son, based on the abuse you've described. But Brenda," he continued, leaning forward, his expression grave, "you must understand what you would be up against. The Sinclairs are wealthy and powerful. They will hire the best lawyers money can buy. They will paint you as an unstable, hysterical woman who kidnapped her own child out of spite. They will deny everything and use their influence to discredit you at every turn. It will be a brutal, ugly fight." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We would need proof of the abuse, witnesses, anything. It would be your word against theirs. It's a fight we can wage, but I need to know if you are prepared for it." The choice was laid bare before me. I could run and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the shadow to fall again. Or I could stand my ground here and fight. It would be a war against a giant, a war I was likely to lose. I looked out the window of the lawyer's high-rise office at the sprawling city below. All those people, living their lives, completely unaware of the battle being waged in this quiet room. I thought of my son, of his laughter in the park, of his innocent, trusting face as he slept. I thought of the future Mr. Sinclair had planned for him. "Are you ready to fight, Brenda?" Mr. Davies asked again, his voice gentle but firm. "Because I promise you, they will come at you with everything they have." I looked across the polished expanse of the lawyer's desk at the cityscape stretching out behind him, a world of sharp angles and indifferent glass. I saw my own reflection, a faint, ghostly image superimposed over the towers, and for a moment I saw the scared girl from Port Blossom staring back at me. Then I looked at Mr. Davies, at his patient, waiting eyes, and I thought of my son, Robert. I thought of his laughter, which was the purest sound I had ever known. I thought of the dark, predetermined future Mr. Sinclair had planned for him. The girl in the window vanished, and in her place was a mother, a warrior. The fear was still there, a cold coil in my stomach, but the anger was hotter. The love was strongest of all. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet, but as solid and unshakable as the granite cliffs of home. "I'm ready to fight." The war that followed was everything Mr. Davies had predicted, and worse. The Sinclair lawyers descended with the fury of a winter storm. They filed a countersuit, officially accusing me of kidnapping and malicious parental alienation. They painted a picture of me as a disturbed, ungrateful young woman from a poor background, who had been overwhelmed by the pressures of city life and had run away in a fit of hysteria, cruelly tearing a son away from his loving father. They produced signed affidavits from family friends in Boston, people I had never even met, attesting to what a devoted husband Carl had been. It was a masterclass in character assassination, a mountain of expensive, carefully constructed lies. The days turned into a blur of legal maneuvering. There were depositions in sterile conference rooms where I had to sit across a table from Carl and his father for the first time since my escape. Carl was venomous, his eyes burning with a hateful rage. He spat out lie after lie, describing a happy marriage that I had inexplicably destroyed. Mr. Sinclair was far more dangerous. He was the picture of a concerned, heartbroken grandfather. His voice was smooth, reasonable, full of sorrow. He spoke of his worry for my fragile mental state and his deep, abiding love for the grandson who had been stolen from him. He was so convincing that at times I almost felt the room begin to turn against me. But I held on. I told my truth, simply and without hysterics. I spoke of the loneliness, the control, the fear. I did not have proof of the physical violence. The bruises had long since faded, and the worst injuries were to my soul. My case, as Mr. Davies had warned, was weak. Our breakthrough came from the one place I thought was lost to me, the past. Mr. Davies, on a hunch, hired a private investigator to go to Boston. He found Joan, my dear, brave Joan. At first, she was terrified. The Sinclairs had let it be known that anyone who helped me would face consequences. But when she heard what they were accusing me of, her fear was overcome by her decency. She agreed to give a sworn deposition. She testified to what she had seen: my isolation, my fear, the times I had flinched from a sudden movement. Most damningly, she testified about the night of my miscarriage, about Carl's callous indifference and the state I was in when I returned from the hospital. Her testimony was the first solid crack in the Sinclairs' perfect facade. It was the word of a decent, ordinary woman against theirs, and it had the undeniable ring of truth. The legal battle dragged on for months, a slow, grinding war of attrition designed to exhaust my spirit and my limited finances, which Mrs. Davenport was generously funding. And then the nature of the war changed. It was not a legal notice or a court summons, but a phone call late one evening. It was an unfamiliar number. When I answered, the voice on the other end was one I never expected to hear again outside of a courtroom. It was Mr. Sinclair. "Brenda," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. It sounded tired. "We need to talk. Alone." I met him in a quiet, empty cafe, a place of his choosing. He looked older than he had in the deposition room, and for the first time I saw a flicker of frailty beneath the ironclad exterior. He didn't bother with pretenses. "I am dying," he said, staring into his cup of black coffee. "The doctors give me a year, maybe less. This court case, it's not how I wish to spend my final months." I said nothing, my mind reeling. This wasn't a trick. I could see the truth of it in the deep lines of his face, in the slight tremor in his hand. "I have underestimated you," he continued, finally looking at me. "I thought you were a simple girl I could control. I was wrong. You have your father's stubbornness, his integrity." He paused. "And this public fight, it is becoming messy. It threatens to tarnish the family name, the legacy I have spent my life building. That is an outcome I will not permit." He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were not legal documents, but financial records, photographs, copies of ledgers. They detailed a pattern of embezzlement and fraud, of illegal dealings Carl had been conducting for years, skimming from the company accounts to fund his secret life, his mistress, his gambling. It was a portfolio of ruin. "Carl has always been a disappointment," Mr. Sinclair said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Weak, impulsive, violent. He is not a worthy heir. Robert is my last chance at a legacy, a real one." I finally understood. This was not about justice. It was about control. The court case was no longer a tool he could manage, so he was choosing another one. He was offering me his own son as a sacrifice to protect the family name and get what he wanted. "What is it you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I want you to take this envelope to your lawyer," he said. "It is enough to put Carl in prison for a very long time. It will end his threat to you and to Robert permanently. The custody suit will be dropped. You will be free." "And in return?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "In return, I wish to see my grandson, not as Mr. Sinclair, the patriarch, just as an old man. I want to be a small part of his life for the time I have left. I want to see him grow. That is my price." He then looked at me, his eyes holding a depth of darkness I had never seen before. "Your father. It was not an accident," he confessed, his voice low. "He came to me, threatened to expose some of my business practices if I forced you to marry Carl. I sent men to his boat simply to scare him, to damage his new engine, to remind him of his place. But Carl was with them, and my son. He has always been too eager to turn fear into violence. They went too far." The confession I had waited years for. It brought no relief, only a cold, sickening finality. My father had died fighting for me. I sat there, the evidence that could free me in my hands, the confession that damned my tormentor on the table between us. I was being offered a deal with the devil, a clean end to my nightmare in exchange for allowing that same devil a place in my son's life. But I looked at the cold, dying man across from me, and I realized he no longer held any real power over me. The power was in my hands now. I could send both father and son to prison. But what would that mean for Robert? A life defined by a spectacular public scandal? Or I could accept this twisted peace offering and simply be free. "He will never know you are his grandfather," I said, my terms. "You will be a family friend, nothing more. You will never speak of the past. You will not try to influence him. You will simply be an old man who visits occasionally." A flicker of pain, or perhaps just wounded pride, crossed his face. "Agreed," he said. The end came swiftly after that. I gave the evidence to Mr. Davies. Carl was arrested, and faced with the irrefutable proof of his crimes, he was sentenced to a long term in prison. The Sinclair name was mentioned, but Mr. Sinclair, with his army of lawyers, managed to frame it as the unfortunate actions of a single rogue employee, his own son. He paid a hefty fine, but his empire remained intact. He died 10 months later, quietly, in a hospital bed. He had kept his word. He visited Robert a handful of times, a subdued, quiet old man who brought books of adventure stories and spoke of faraway places. Robert knew him only as Mr. Harrison, a kind but sad friend of his mother's. And we were free, truly, finally free. That was so many years ago. I am an old woman now, and my hands, though gnarled with age, are still busy. My little business, Brenda Ellion Needlepoint, became my life's work, a small but respected name in the world of textile art. My mother, Donna, eventually found the courage to leave Port Blossom and came to live with me in New York. We healed the old wounds between us, point by painstaking point, like a complicated embroidery, and she spent her final years in peace, watching her grandson grow. Robert is a good man, a wonderful man. He has my father's quiet strength and a kindness that is all his own. He grew up to be an architect, one who specializes in restoring old, beautiful buildings, breathing life back into them. He takes what is broken and makes it whole again. The symbolism is not lost on me. He knows everything. I told him the whole story when he was old enough to understand. It is a part of him, but it does not define him. He is proof that a river of poison can be stopped, that a new, clean spring can emerge. Last year, he married a wonderful woman, and just 2 months ago, they gave me the gift I never thought I'd live to see, a granddaughter. They named her Elaine. When I hold little Elaine in my arms, her tiny body so full of promise, I feel the final stitch of my life's tapestry fall into place. The pain, the fear, the long years of struggle, it all led to this perfect, peaceful moment. I broke the chain. I survived the monsters who wear suits, and I built a garden in the wasteland they left behind. My victory was not in their defeat, but in the life I built, the son I raised, and the legacy of love that will now be passed down to his daughter. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please, share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.